This is the Door History Podcast, and my name is Naomi Clifford. Here at the Door, we like to push the door, open the door, unlock the door, but our aim is to cast some light on hitherto unknown stories of women. Just try and balance things up a little bit. They might not be famous women, but I think you'll be interested in hearing about them.
The door.
The door. The door.
The door.
The door.
The door. The door. The door.
We're going to kick off with that rare thing, a 17th century feminist poet. Her name was Sarah Fyge Egerton, born Sarah Fyge in London in 1672. She published her first major poem at the age of 14. It was called The Female Advocate, and it was written in response to a poem written by a man, Robert Gould, and the title of that was Love Given Her, or a satire on the inconstancy of woman. She was pretty outspoken, as you can imagine, and that got her into quite a lot of trouble with her own father, who chucked her out of home. She was married first. I don't know what the name of her first husband was, but her second was called Thomas Egerton. Now, at some point, I actually don't know the year this was written, but she wrote the Emulation, and that really is about the state that women are kept in, which amounts to a sort of form of slavery. She saw marriage as a form of slavery. She felt that women would overcome this situation through education, and of course that did happen. It just took quite a few centuries, and the work is not finished. So here it is, the Emulation. Before we start, I should say that the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Old Testament Bible. Genesis, Exodus, etc. Anyway, here we go, the Emulation.
Say, tyrant custom, why must we obey the impositions of thy haughty sway? From the first dawn of life unto the grave, poor womankind's in every state a slave. The nurse, the mistress, parent, and the swain, for love she must, there's none escape that pain. Then comes the last, the fatal slavery. The husband with insulting tyranny can have ill manners justified by law, for men all join to keep the wife in awe. Moses, who first our freedom did rebuke, was married when he writ the Pentateuch. They're wise to keep us slaves, for well they know, if we were loose, we soon would make them so. We yield like vanquished kings, whom fetters bind, when chance of war is to usurpers kind, submit in form, but there'd our thoughts control, and lay restraints on the impassive soul. They fear we should excel their sluggish parts, should we attempt the science and the arts, pretend they were designed for them alone, so keep us fools to raise their own renown. Thus priests of old, their grandeur to maintain, cried vulgar eyes would sacred laws profane, so kept the mysteries behind a screen. Their homage and the name were lost had they been seen. But in this blessed age, such freedom's given, that every man explains the will of heaven. And shall we women now sit tamely by, make no excursions in philosophy, or grace our thoughts in tuneful poetry? We will our rights in learning's world maintain, which empire now shall know a female reign. Come, all ye fair, the great attempt improve, divinely imitate the realms above. There's 10 celestial females govern wit, and but 2 gods that dare pretend to it. And shall these finite males reverse their rules? No, we'll be wits, and then men must be fools.
The Emulation was read by Roli Okorodudu. I'm here with Sharon Wright, who's written a fantastic biography of Maria Brontë. Actually, the first biography of Maria for 200 years. And this year is part of the amazing 5-year bicentenary of the Brontës, which ends, when does it end, Sharon?
Well, it ends next year with Anne Bronte's bicentenary year, which will be 2020. So it's 200 years since she was born. Began with Charlotte in 2016, then Branwell year after. Last year was Emily. This year's Patrick Bronte's year, and next year's Anne's. So the missing Bronte from all that, of course, was Mrs. Bronte.
Yes, and hopefully your book will put that straight, put that right, because as you say in your book, there is this lack of information out there about Maria, although it was sitting there for centuries, and you've done a fantastic research job to bring it all together in your book.
Thank you.
I thought we'd start with some just a description of Maria's life and where she started out from, and just a bit about Maria herself.
So Maria was born into a wealthy merchant family in Penzance in 1783, at the height of the Georgian era. She was part of a large family, a very prominent family. Her brother went on to be the mayor. Her father was a well-to-do merchant and part of the Penzance Corporation.
So they were
the gentlemen. Yeah. They were referred to as gentlemen in the records. Yeah. So of course she was well educated. She had a nice house in the most fashionable street in town. She was a contemporary of Jane Austen. She would have gone with her sisters to the assembly rooms in Chapel Street where she lived. And when her parents died, she lived alone with her mother, and then when she died, just her sisters, and referred to herself in letters as perfectly her own mistress. So she was a very independent, well-educated, well-read, plugged-in young woman of Penzance, which itself was a very bustling, cosmopolitan place. Of course, there were redcoats going to and from the French wars. There was trade coming through. It was a very, very interesting place to grow up.
And she got to the age of 29, not having married.
Yes.
And then circumstances brought her up to Yorkshire.
Yes. She was from her family were leading Wesleyans, and through a series of Wesleyan connections and events, she ended up going to Yorkshire to help her aunt and uncle, who set up a Wesleyan boarding school there, the sons of itinerant preachers. So she travelled 400 miles by herself, past highwaymen and all the many things that could happen.
It's astonishing, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I found lots of scary stories that she would have...
You think that a lot of women were not even allowed to travel alone.
Oh, well, exactly. But she had a lot of gumption, did Maria Branwell. So she went, in her head, going on a working holiday and would never return, which you can see through all her letters and the rest of her life was a great sadness to her. She was always very homesick. But once there, she met Patrick Brontë at the school. He was a visiting examiner, and it was absolutely a passionate love at first sight, whirlwind romance, and they were married by the end of 1812. So they met about April to June. They were married end of December.
And they went through a very sweet ceremony, a triple
yes,
marriage ceremony.
I think there's a touch of the bridezilla in some of those letters, because when she loses her rag and you realise that actually she's writing love letters to Patrick, but she's also letters are flying between Penzance and Appley Bridge, the school.
So just describe this triple marriage for us.
So her cousin Jane is marrying Patrick's best friend William. So Maria and Patrick are getting married on the same day as Jane and William. They're going to be each other's bridesmaid and each other's minister, because William and Patrick are both clergymen, obviously. They go down the aisle together, they get married. Meanwhile, at the same hour and the same day, down in Madron Church in Penzance, her little sister Charlotte is also getting married. So it's a triple Regency wedding, and that's all done by letter. So no wonder she's a bit tense and something.
no WhatsApp to help them out.
No WhatsApp, but yeah, I mean, her niece said later, there might never have been another wedding like it. Certainly not at the time.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And in the book, I asked Eleanor Broughton, who's the Brontë dress historian, to imagine their wedding outfits, which she has done. And
yes, that's a lovely picture.
It is. It's absolutely. It comes from Eleanor's expertise and gives you an idea of them on their wedding day, walking to church.
Patrick was quite quite someone to take on. I mean, in your book you talk about people describing his oddness.
Yes.
And how Maria either didn't see that oddness or didn't mind it. And that makes me love her a little bit more, actually.
Absolutely. She saw through. He was always called peculiar, wasn't he?
Yes.
Always people say, very good man, but a bit peculiar. And they also called him Old Staff because he went everywhere with this big, I don't know how to say it, shillelagh.
Yeah, but the big sort of walking
Irish staff, like St
yes,
Patrick, really.
yes.
Walked everywhere.
Yeah.
Used to do 24 miles to see her and back.
Mm-hmm. Something their children really inherited,
Yes,
this
absolutely.
ability to just stride about
Always
along the
walking.
moors. Yeah.
And she was very fit and healthy as well. And this idea of her, just because she was little and small, she was a little pixie, like Charlotte Brontë really, that she was somehow frail, and she really wasn't.
No,
It
and
was only at the end when
produced
cancer.
6 healthy children, didn't she? No, with no losses.
No.
Yes, it was very poignant to read her end, which came at the age of 38.
Yes. So in the end of January in 1821, she literally collapsed at the parsonage in Haworth, and it was just a hammer blow. The doctor came and said she had an internal cancer and she was going to die. So that took me into investigating and sort of reflecting on what kind of cancer she might have had with the knowledge we have now. And I spoke to a doctor and I looked at the literature. And whereas she was supposed to have had uterine cancer, it seemed more likely to me that she had cervical cancer, because you can be in very advanced state in cervical cancer and suddenly the symptoms are manifest. But also just her profile and her risk factors would put her more at risk of cervical and uterine. But of course, cancer, we all know, don't we, chooses its victims at random often, we don't know.
No.
But she certainly was terminally ill, and she took 7 months to die in absolute agony.
Been
Absolute
terrible
agony.
for everyone.
Yeah. And poor Patrick nursed her through the night and was working through the day. The children were tiptoeing around. Her sister came up to help her. The godmothers, their best friends, who I call the sort of Bradford blue stockings over in Thornton, who were quite well to do, and they'd come over and help, and just awful. And when she did die, it was just heartbreaking, because she was only 38, and that evangelical outlook demanded really that you had an ecstatic death, that you would, so you could see heaven, you were ready to step out of life into heaven, and you were ready for it, but she wasn't. She was 38, she was leaving 6 little children and the love of her life, and she wasn't ready to die. It was just very, very tragic.
And she was full of potential herself.
She was.
And, such a shame that we didn't get to know her later in life.
No. And that's why, really, I think she fell from the record, because the children were young.
Yes, now this is very interesting.
Yeah.
When you came to write the book, you were told that there really wasn't enough material to write a book on her.
Yes.
And this turned out not to be the case.
No, I think it was received wisdom in lots of ways, because there is so much written and known about the Brontë siblings and Patrick. Because Patrick, it's his year this year, and he was an astonishing man and campaigner. He did a great deal in his life, aside from being the father of writers. So he was greatly loved, and his achievements were many, sort of social achievements and literary ones as well. But Maria, when I first started asking, I said, why has nobody ever written a biography of Maria, of the mother of the Brontës? And people just would shrug and say, oh, there's not enough on her. And I used to think, I bet there is. If you really go looking, I bet there is, and there is. And I feel like
you've done wonderful detective work to bring her out from the archives. Just such fascinating areas, such as what she read and who her friends were, and how she got, how she physically got to Yorkshire, as we've briefly discussed. And
it was such an odyssey, though, and I don't know if you feel this when you're writing your books, but I did more than once felt like I'd bitten off more than I can chew, from being told there's not enough to thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much, and I want to do it justice and do it properly.
Yes.
And just feeling immersed in this extraordinary untold story. I wanted to go stomping around going, who thought there wasn't enough? Receive wisdom. Yeah.
One of the things that really interested me the many things that interested me in your book was the reading list. What Maria Branwell read as a young woman in Penzance. You've compiled this fantastic list of her reading material. And obviously there was a lot of religious stuff in there, and that sat very happily alongside the Ladies' Magazine, for instance. Tell us a bit about the Ladies' Magazine and what it did and what happened to those magazines.
Yes, well, she and her sister, I mean, we know that Elizabeth and Maria for sure, but I'm sure all the sisters would have passed around the Ladies' Magazine, which was wildly popular in its time, and it gave a voice to women writers, female opinion. But a big part of that was the Gothic fiction that they would run. So Gothic fiction was huge in the very late 1700s and going into the 1800s, when Maria was a young woman. And much as I used to be agog to get my comics and my magazines when I was that age, she would read her Ladies' Magazine. And because they were quite well-to-do, theirs were bound, you know. You could also get Penny Dreadful versions, I think, but they were called Scarlet Shockers or something like that. But she read the full thing, and they're absolutely full of these stories of women in spooky old castles, ghastly shrieks in the night, you know, running around.
Fantastic.
Everything you think of as Gothic,
so
really.
Trashy
Yes.
novels, really.
Yes.
Yes.
And the absolute stories and era that Jane Austen sends up in Northanger Abbey.
Yes,
You know, that's really interesting when I draw parallels later when that comes out and Maria's take. But those stories absolutely suffuse the Brontes' work in a way, in that, you know, Charlotte Bronte absolutely loved those magazines. She said she'd bunk off and read them, and she was
in secret
until Patrick Bronte found them and burnt them, apparently one black day, she says. And Charlotte Bronte references several of those stories in particular, so I went back and looked at those stories. I described them, what happened, and then sort of the interplay between Maria and Charlotte's sensibilities, really, around that Gothic theme.
Well, Jane Eyre itself has got a very Gothic theme.
Absolutely.
You know, Mad Woman in the Attic, as you point out.
Completely. And Ellen Nussey talks about the how she'd absolutely terrify their friends at school with Gothic stories.
Wow, that's a lovely picture, isn't it? The young Charlotte.
Yeah, frightening.
Entertaining her friends with horror stories.
All these spellbound girls, you know, listening.
Yes.
So there's all those threads, and of course Emily Bronte, that sort of those
Wuthering
liminal
Heights
spaces
is
about
absolutely nuts, isn't it?
Absolutely,
Really,
and that the living and the dead and the Spacey and habit. And also there's a reading list of the Penzance Ladies Book Group, as I say, which is still in existence actually, down at the Morab Library. And where there are handwritten lists of the books that they were reading and circulating, which is absolutely a treasure trove.
Yeah.
There was one lady called Mrs. Treweek, who was an absolute game old bird by the sound of it. She had all these adventures, all these hilarious stories about, you know, when a pig got loose on market day and she ended up riding it into a china shop. And
This is in Penzance?
Yeah, and the year when it says Mrs. Treweek's books, and then there's a list.
Oh, okay, so you can find out what Mrs. Treweek is.
What she had chosen as president to circulate around the ladies, so Maria and her
And they were
friends.
only allowed to have the books for 4 days, so they must have gobbled them up.
Absolutely, and there were lots of periodicals in there, there were lots of tracts, there were the magazines, but in among as well were very sort of serious books about history and religious books and travel books, an awful lot of travel books. So this was doing the rounds, and Maria would have been a member. So it's very interesting to get that insight into what she was reading before she went even to Yorkshire.
And it really rounds her out as a person.
It really does, because it gives you a sense of that contemporary thinking amongst women of her class and her age. A lot of those books were by women. A lot of those books I'd never heard of and have just faded into obscurity, but they were bestsellers. They were the must-read then, you know, and someone will say to you now, we should read this, should read that. Fascinating.
So Sharon, what really sparked your interest in the Brontes? How did you pick up the Brontes as something that you really, really wanted to research, and particularly Maria Bronte?
Well, it's quite an interesting journey, really. I mean, I was born and brought up in Bradford, like the Bronte sisters themselves, but the Brontes were never part of my curriculum. I did English to A-level, never studied the Brontes. I mean, it's much different now, I think. But I was made to read Jane Austen, which I can honestly say I didn't enjoy.
No, funny enough, neither did I first time. And it took one special teacher to really bring it out, and show me what I've been
Yes.
missing.
No, I would bring a different eye to it now, but... And then I became a reporter, journalist on the local paper that covered Haworth. So I would cover all the shenanigans in Brontë land. There was always, something kicking off, really. Planning applications or some affront to the memory, But I always felt that town and gown feeling, really. And I was very much a town. Then left Yorkshire to work around the country and ended up in London, like you often do as a journalist. And then it was only going back to Yorkshire, really, But part of that journey was working in the West Country, where I grew to love the West Country, actually. So I was there in my late 20s. When Maria was in her late 20s, she was making that reverse journey, wasn't she, from the West Country to the West Riding.
To Yorkshire, and you're doing the other way around.
And at the time, I didn't know that Mrs Brontë, such celebrities at home, was actually a Cornish woman. I didn't know that then either. So it was only as a writer and a wife and a mother going back to Yorkshire that I went on a walking tour with my cousins that I grew up with, a cousin and a friend I grew up with. And absolutely we were so outraged that we had not... It was so brilliant and it brought alive these amazing life stories. How would we not known that? I knew the Brontë Burger sketch by Victoria Wood. I could spot Larry Olivier's Heathcliff on a poster, but I certainly hadn't... And then I became preoccupied by Mrs Brontë. Totally eclipsed by the genius of her children.
Yes, such an absence.
Yeah.
Yes, and Patrick is there, larger than life.
Absolutely.
Very long-lived, the patriarch.
Yeah.
And no Mrs Brontë.
Where was it, and why did he never remarry? And she was... So in a way, I always call this the prequel, before they were famous Brontës, because without Maria, having a bit of get up and go and gumption and setting off to Yorkshire, and meeting Patrick, who she loved, there'd be no Brontës, would there?
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been a delight to talk to you.
Likewise.
Now we've pushed the door open on Maria Branwell. We're not going to close it. It's going to remain open.
The door. The door. The door. The door. The door.
You come to the end of our podcast. My name is Lina Augustensen and I'm the producer.
And I am Naomi Clifford, history writer. All details of this episode are on our website, thedoorpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media, on Facebook. On Twitter, we are at The Door Podcast.
You can subscribe to us as well, and on any of the platforms that we're on, just follow the links.
You can also sign up for a newsletter on our website, which will tell you when the next episode drops.
And yeah, I think that's it.
That is it.
Yes.